Hello there, friends. Welcome to the mill. My name is James, and Dusty has once again very graciously allowed me to take over the channel for the week. Today I will be discussing the next faction as we round the corner of the classic Scythe factions, Saxony. Saxony's faction ability is Dominate. There is no limit to the stars from completing objectives and winning combat. One of the things I really like about the faction abilities in Scythe is that each one breaks what I would consider to be one of the cardinal rules of Scythe, and thereby reinforces those rules for all of the other players. Normally, we are only able to complete one objective and win 2 combats, but Saxony, of course, can do that as much as the player would like, or is able to do. One of the criticisms that I often see online of Scythe is that despite the really cool looking mechs on the cover, it's not really a combat-oriented game. It's much more of an optimization puzzle, and the primary purpose of the mechs is really to move the workers around the board. And while I do think that is a somewhat fair criticism, that drastically changes when Saxony is involved in the game. When Saxony is playing, combats are likely to happen far more frequently, especially if that Saxony player enjoys combats and perhaps has practiced with the faction in the past. So, what's important to the Saxony player in setting up those combat wins? Well, we need to dive right into the mech abilities and take a look at those. The river walk for Saxony can get us to either of these two wooded spaces here, or bring us back to the mountain on our starting peninsula. And as we look around the board, I'm gonna bring up this river walk key again. We can see the areas on the other starting peninsulas where Saxony is likely to intrude. So you can see here Saxony can move into the Crimea starting peninsula, into the Polonia starting peninsula, and very easily into the Nord starting peninsula. But Rusviet is entirely immune from incursion by Saxony. And of course, if Togawa or Albion are in the game, those are very likely targets for Saxony, because both of those factions lack the ability to move their character and their mech 2 spaces unless they go to the factory first. So it's very likely that if Saxony is able to win a combat against Togawa or Albion, the Albion and Togawa players are not likely to be able to respond to Saxony quite as quickly as some of the other players might be able to. Moving back to the mechs, we have Underpass, move between any mountain you control and any tunnel. I'm going to turn Riverwalk back off. So that mountain you control is going to be this starting mountain on your peninsula, and that allows you to access these tunnels a little more quickly than the other factions. And this is important because often the tunnels will be where factions end up emerging from their respective starting peninsulas. An excellent combo with that underpass ability is Disarm. Before combat on a tunnel, opponent loses 2 power. This is quite powerful, as it would allow you to weaken your opponent, potentially defeating one mech with one mech, and making the 2 mech versus 1 mech a much easier victory. It's not uncommon for a Saxony player who's trying to get that combat win to find that the combat cards are where the win comes from. So you'll want to look into how are you going to build your combat engine early on. And that is usually from field. That's where we're going to get the recruit, and then that will generate the combat cards for us. But you'll notice, of course, that there is no field in the starting peninsula for Saxony. So Saxony is usually going to have to find that grain someplace else. In this case, I'll be able to trade for it. Hopefully I can upgrade this, and then this action will become trade 2, get the 2 grain, and immediately recruit. And I'm going to want to build up as many of those combat cards as I can, as quickly as possible. So I'll be using the oil that I have here in my starting peninsula in order to fund that crucial upgrade, and then of course the metal to bring up the mechs. And as you can see here, this is actually a very good board for the Saxon player, because the mechs, which of course we're going to want all 4 of, will be generating 3 coins for us. So very strong board. This is the militant board. And in fact, the objectives aren't too bad either. We've got 3 or less popularity. That's probably going to happen. Have at least 13 power and at least 2 mechs. It's not hard at all to get for Saxony. And then control at least 3 tunnels at the end of your turn. So if I were playing this game either here in the digital edition or in real life with friends, I would be pretty excited if I drew Saxony this board and these 2 objectives. Let's pull these max back up. Of course, the last one is speed. So if you are going to be choosing an order for your mechs, I would say that the underpass and speed would probably be the first 2. And then depending on the power levels of the other players, you would probably go for disarm for the 3rd. That underpass and speed is going to allow you to get your mechs out into the field quickly. It's going to allow you to set up incursions into those starting peninsulas for everyone except, of course, for Roosevelt. Playing against Saxony can often feel a bit frustrating, as just the nature of the faction ability tends to make the player a little bit more aggressive than other players might normally play Scythe. But if you have that one player in your group who's interested in the idea of Scythe, but has that criticism, oh, well, Scythe, I've heard, doesn't really have a lot of combat, give that player the Saxony faction, and that might well sate that criticism. I'd also like to talk briefly about objectives. Generally, when I play Scythe, I look at objectives maybe on my 2nd or 3rd turn and see if I think I'll be able to accomplish either of them over the course of the game. But of course with Saxony, since you can get 2 of them, I often find myself looking at them early on and maybe planning a bit of a strategy around them. It's very nice when you can find yourself in possession of 2 of the control 3 of a particular hex. Those are pretty strong for Saxony and easily achievable due to Saxony's pretty strong mobility. Of course, there's the one that you can fulfill essentially just by getting 8 workers. That's something that you'll probably end up doing. So it's always good to look at those objectives quite early on in Saxony to see if there's a way that you can combine the 2 of them, combo them, and get both of them, in addition to perhaps 4 combat stars or 3 combat stars and something else. So how do you defend against Saxony? Well, you'll want to see what the Saxon player is doing and try to respond accordingly. And I know that sounds a bit simplistic, but what I'm trying to say is if the Saxon player is building up combat cards, build up combat cards as well. If the Saxon player is pumping up power level, building mechs, try to respond with those. And also try to shield both your character and your mechs with workers. Because in order to attack your character or your mech, the Saxony player will have to be able to move directly onto the hex where that character or mech is. And if you have workers in between, say the tunnels, for example, or if you go into this faction ability section and turn on Riverwalk, you can see, okay, well, I know this hex is going to be vulnerable. If I'm playing Crimea, this hex will be vulnerable to Saxony, so I don't want to put a mech right there. I don't want to put my character right there. I want to leave a worker there, so that if Saxony does decide to go from the tundra here into the mountain, that worker will stop the first mech, and then if he wants to bring in two mechs, well, then that's what he would have to do. And there would be that popularity hit every time for removing those workers. Another interesting thing about Saxony is going to be the factory. I haven't talked very much about factory as I've gone through these sessions, but Saxony can really benefit from the factory as it can be another way to acquire combat cards, sort of out of the normal combat card generation turn. It can be a way to acquire mechs easily if for some reason you're having trouble generating the metal. It can often plug a hole in your strategy. Whatever your strategy is, the factory is especially useful to Saxony, I think. I often find myself going there pretty early on as Saxony compared to some of the other factions. Maybe Rusviet, Saxony and Rusviet, I would say, get to the factory pretty early and pretty quickly. Some of the other factions aren't as quite as concerned with it as Saxony is, certainly. Another way that you can defend against Saxony is simply by picking a strategy that doesn't revolve around mechs. So you say, oh, Saxony's in the game. I know he's going to be out for blood. You're going to want to look to other strategies where you're just not going to give the Saxon player targets. And that's a good idea, really, if you see any faction that is going for a very combat heavy focus, putting workers in front of your mechs, or finding other things to build and protecting your character with your workers can often protect you from those combat hungry players. Saxony is another faction where if I see that the combat angle isn't going to work for one reason or another, Saxony can actually do pretty well with the building generation, and that's because we've got the two wood spaces, of course, and the way that Saxony's sort of area is laid out here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hexes that are sort of bottlenecked here at this one tunnel. And that can give Saxony a lot of room for placing those buildings in such a way that we've got the structure bonus. And in fact, I was talking about earlier how this particular setup just happened to favor Saxony. Well, so does the structure bonus. It's very easy for Saxony to get to the tunnels, and then very easy for Saxony to place those structures onto the tunnels. Now, will I be doing that a lot with this board? Probably not, because of how expensive those structures are on this board. But if I found myself with another board where maybe the structure gave me 3 coins, I would seriously consider it. So there are alternatives to fighting, as the saying goes. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this deep dive into Saxony. If you have any questions or thoughts, I would love to see them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.